Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire. Now, this came out this year, 2024, and this is the 38th film in the Godzilla franchise overall, which started in 1954 with the original Japanese classic from Ishiro Honda. And this is the 10th live-action film in the King Kong franchise, a franchise that started all the way back in 1933 with the original King Kong from Merian C. And this is the third crossover between these two franchises, the first, of course, being 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla. This is also the fifth film of Legendary's Monsterverse, which started in 2014 with the American Godzilla reboot from Gareth Edwards, which was followed in 2017 with the King Kong reboot, Kong Skull Island, and then that was followed by 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, and then that was followed in 2021 with Godzilla vs. Kong, which this movie is a direct sequel to. Now, I already reviewed all the other Godzilla movies, which you can see on my playlist entitled Godzilla Reviews, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Also in 2018, me and my friend Jeremy reviewed all the King Kong movies that were out at the time, including the original King Kong vs. Godzilla, meaning that I technically have two separate reviews of that movie up on my YouTube channel, but that's neither here nor there. Now, both this and Godzilla vs. Kong were directed by Adam Wingard, who, prior to these movies, directed several horror films like You're Next, The Guest, the third Blair Witch movie, and the American adaptation of Death Note. Now, The New Empire, I think, is probably the weakest of the Monsterverse so far, but it's not bad. I had a lot of fun with this movie. Now, the Monsterverse can be kind of divisive among fans. Some people love it, and some people really hate it. Personally, I like these movies a lot. I think they're a lot of fun. But I think what honestly might have hurt this movie was the fact that it came out only a few months after Godzilla Minus One. Now, Godzilla Minus One is completely unconnected to the Monsterverse. It's completely within its own continuity because as the Monsterverse is going on, Japan is still making their own Godzilla movies. In 2016, you had Shin Godzilla, and then you had the anime Godzilla trilogy. And then, of course, last year you had Godzilla Minus One, which I think, objectively speaking, is probably the best film in the franchise since the original Godzilla, and in some ways it does kind of top the original film. And Minus One was kind of a revelation for non-Godzilla fans, because you saw people who never gave a shit about Godzilla all of a sudden putting that movie on their top 10 list at the end of the year. It was really a thought-provoking science fiction film and a compelling human drama that just happened to feature Godzilla, which of course is what the original film was like, but again, Minus One probably came the closest to matching the tone and themes of the original 1954 film, and honestly, there are things that Minus One did better than the original. Even though the original Godzilla is my favorite film of all time, objectively speaking, there are things about Minus One that are objectively better than the 54 film. So, regardless of the fact that this is completely unconnected to Minus One, the fact that this came out not that long after Minus One, I think hurt it regardless. Because this is a very silly and very goofy movie, but you know what? So are a lot of the other Godzilla movies, with the exception of the original and Minus One and a select few other films. A lot of this franchise is very campy and very goofy, and I mean that lovingly so. I love the sillier Godzilla movies just as much as I like the serious-minded Godzilla films, and as a lifelong Godzilla fan, I can tell you there's room for both interpretations of the character. It's the same thing with the Batman franchise. There's room for the goofy-ass Adam West Batman shit, and then there's room for the more serious, more adult-oriented interpretations of the Batman mythos, like the Christopher Nolan films, or the Matt Reeves Batman, or Todd Phillips' Joker. I saw a post on Instagram that I think summed it up pretty well. It basically said, if -1 is the spiritual successor of the original Godzilla, then New Empire could be looked at as the spiritual successor of something like Godzilla vs. Megalon, where it really is just a monster romp, and it's not really meant to be anything more or less than that. So, the plot of the movie is it's set several years after the events of Godzilla vs. Kong. King Kong now inhabits the Hollow Earth, which is this massive ecosystem that exists thousands of miles under the Earth's surface. The way it's presented in the movie is, it's almost like another planet contained within our own planet, and it's a world filled with prehistoric creatures and other strange monsters. Meanwhile, Godzilla is on the surface world defending it from other monsters. But in the movie, we follow the character of Gia, who is the last surviving member of the Iwi tribe from Skull Island, and it appears that she's having almost like these psychic visions of something that's happening in the Hollow Earth. It also appears that Godzilla is sensing whatever this is happening in the Hollow Earth, and it's really upsetting him. Like, it appears that something big is coming. Now, Kong was previously thought to be the last of his species, but he ends up discovering others of his kind. It turns out deep within the Hollow Earth there is an entire society of intelligent giant apes who are ruled over by a tyrannical leader known as the Scar King, who keeps his people at bay with the help of an ice dragon called Shimo. So now Scar King wants to take over the surface world, and now mankind's only hope is to unite King Kong and Godzilla to take on this threat. So, people complain all the time about the human characters in these movies, but to be honest, I actually really liked this cast. Don't get me wrong, the characters in this movie are certainly not deep or complex by any means, but I think they're likable enough, and they serve the story well, and you can tell the actors are having a lot of fun in their roles. Gia is easily the best human character in the movie, and honestly, she was the best human character in the previous film as well. She's actually one of the better written human characters in the entire Monsterverse franchise. And with her having sort of a psychic link to the monsters, you can tell that they're basically making her the Miki Sagusa of this series. And Gia, of course, is once again played by Kaylee Hottle. You also have Rebecca Hall reprising her role as Dr. Andrews from the previous film, who is Gia's adopted mother, and she does a good job as well. You also have Brian Tyree Henry reprising his role as Bernie from the previous film. Now, as much as Gia might be the best written character in the movie, honestly, Dan Stevens kinda stole this movie as Trapper. Trapper was such a fun and entertaining character, and honestly, him and Brian Tyree Henry had great chemistry with each other, and in the movie they kind of tease sort of a bromance between these guys that I thought was honestly kind of adorable. But of course, the highlight of the movie is definitely the monsters, and King Kong and Godzilla are great in the movie. They do some very silly and very comic booky stuff with these characters, but I'm okay with it because this really does feel like a big-budgeted Hollywood version of a Showa film. This basically is a Showa Godzilla film for a modern Hollywood audience. Like, at one point they give King Kong a robot hand because his hand gets all frostbitten from his battle with Shimo. It's very silly, very cartoonish, and very comic book, but you know what? It works. Now, when it comes to the other monsters in the movie, Scar King is a pretty decent villain. I was a little underwhelmed by him when I first saw the movie, but upon this rewatch, he is actually a good villain, and he reminded me a little bit of... Honestly, he's almost like a kaiju version of Immortan Joe from Mad Max Fury Road. But one of my issues, though, is they build Scar King up to be like this big world-ending threat, and by the end of the film, he's honestly dispatched of a little too easily. And I'll be honest, the final battle between Godzilla, Kong, Scar King, and Shimo, I thought was a little anticlimactic, or at least very underwhelming, at least in my opinion. It just kind of happened way too quickly, in my opinion. You also have a young ape in the movie named Suko, who... they basically make him the son of Kong. He's not literally Kong's son, but Kong more or less adopts him by the end of this, but in the beginning, he's attacking Kong just like all the other great apes, and there's a fucking hilarious scene where King Kong just grabs the little shit by the leg and starts swinging him around, hitting the other apes with him. And I will say, I honestly liked what they did with the great apes in this. Like, some of the scenes between King Kong and the other apes honestly played out more like a Planet of the Apes movie than your typical kaiju fare. Now, major spoiler, but Mothra actually shows up in the movie. It turns out that there actually are humans living in the Hollow Earth. It turns out there's an entire Iwi civilization living in the Hollow Earth, and they worship Mothra. And like I said, the character of Gia, they're definitely making her sort of this series equivalent of Miki Sagusa, but you can tell they're also kind of making her the equivalent of the Shobijin or the Mothra twins from the older Godzilla movies. So yeah, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, it's a fun movie, but do not be expecting anything groundbreaking or anything thought-provoking by any means. It's just meant to be sort of a throwaway good time, and if you want to kill a few hours, I would recommend checking the movie out, and especially if you are a fan of King Kong or Godzilla, check the movie out. Again, it's definitely not one of the better Godzilla movies or the better King Kong movies, but it works for what it is, and the movie, it knows what it is too, and I think the movie is successful at what it's trying to be. Now, besides these 5 movies in the Monsterverse, there's also an anime Skull Island series that is supposed to be set within the Monsterverse. I think it's supposed to be set between the events of Kong Skull Island and the events of Godzilla vs. Kong. I haven't seen any of that show, so I can't really comment on it. There's also the show Monarch: Legacy of Monsters. I haven't seen any of that show either, and I've heard mixed things about it. I know it's on Apple TV, and I'll be honest, I don't really want to pay for a whole streaming service just to watch one show. But with how much of a Godzilla fan I am, I probably should check the show out at some point. But keep in mind, there's a lot of expanded Godzilla media that I still have not checked out. Like, I still haven't seen that anime Godzilla series Singular Point yet. I tend to mainly focus on the movies. Now, as far as the potential future of the Monsterverse, I know this guy named Nick Crispino, who was actually in my Godzilla vs. Kong review from a few years ago. He contributes to a site called Kaiju United, and him and some other contributors from the site have done a podcast called Kaiju United Town Hall, and they did an episode on this movie, and one of the co-hosts of that episode had a really interesting idea for a follow-up to this. Now, in the movie, there's talk about how corporations are trying to profit off of and exploit the Hollow Earth, and this idea that this guy on the podcast came up with is, what if there's a corporation that actually tries to give tours of the Hollow Earth, which they claim to be completely safe, and then kind of like a Jurassic Park scenario, something goes horribly, horribly wrong. And that idea, like, That could actually make a really interesting movie that doesn't even have to feature King Kong or Godzilla. It could just be a standalone, even horror movie set within the Monsterverse, specifically in the Hollow Earth. So if they do something like that, they should definitely get dark with it. Another idea for a potential future Monsterverse movie that I think would be pretty cool. Now, I know when the 2014 Godzilla came out, Gareth Edwards expressed interest in doing a remake of Destroy All Monsters, because I know he said that was like his favorite film in the franchise next to the original, and I actually would like to see them do a remake of that movie within the Monsterverse. I think that could be really cool. Like, I'm thinking like there's some kind of threat from outer space. Honestly, make it Gigan, because I would really like to see Gigan in the Monsterverse, but have Gigan be like this big, like, world-ending threat, and you have to have, like, Godzilla, King Kong, and as many of the Earth monsters going up against Gigan and possibly other space monsters. I think that could be a really cool movie, like, as long as they just go, like, balls to the wall with it. Another idea I had that I think would be really cool, and I know it's more of a pipe dream because this is something that only the hardcore Godzilla nerds I think would be into, but I could almost see the Monsterverse doing this because of how crazy these last few Monsterverse movies have been. I would love to see a Godzilla multiverse movie. Like, maybe there's some kind of kaiju, like some kind of interdimensional kaiju that threatens all versions of Earth, and you have, like, all these different versions of Godzilla having to go up against it, and it could be a way to sort of bridge together all the different Godzilla continuities. Like, it turns out the Showa films were taking place in one universe, while the Heisei series was taking place in another universe, and then, like, Shin Godzilla and -1 were taking place on their own versions of Earth, and then, of course, the Monsterverse was taking place on another particular version of Earth. I don't know, I think that would be fun. I mean, it would be hilarious just to see the Monsterverse Godzilla going up against Shin Godzilla, or maybe even have the Showa Godzilla dropkick the -1 Godzilla. That idea, I know, would probably never happen. It's just something that the nerd in me would love to see, even though it will probably be a mess of a movie. So yeah, guys, that was my review of Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, and bye.